Good morning. We are at 41b4. 41b4, we are at the top of the second column on 41b4, Mem Aleph Amud Beis, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel. Okay? Yeah? Y'all see it? Okay, so Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel, Yatz Ladas, person leaves their tchum willingly, Ein lo ela arba amos. So if a person leaves their tchum on purpose, meaning a person knows they have 2,000 amos, and they're like, oh, you know what, I'm just going to walk past it. So all they're allowed to do when they walk past it is they just have 4 amos that they're allowed to walk. Now, obviously, they're not allowed to do so, but once they do, then in this new space that they find themselves, they're now 20 feet away from the edge of their tchum, they're only allowed to walk within 4 amos. Ask the Gemara, Pshita, that's obvious. Hashta misho tziyo nachrim ein lo ela arba amos. The Mishnah already told us that if he was taken away unwillingly, if a person was forced out, right? A non-Jew puts a gun to his head and says, "Hey, leave the tchum," and the person now is 100 feet outside the tchum. All he has is 4 amos. So for sure, if a person goes on purpose, all they're going to have is 4 amos. What's the chiddush? So Gemara says, "Ela ema chazer ladas." Maybe we're talking about a case. So say rather we're talking about a case that the person returns willingly. In other words, they were forced out. Okay, and now when Rav Papa came along, Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel said that the person did it willingly, they're referring to the person returning back. So again, non-Jew puts a gun to his head and says, "Leave the tchum, get out of this area." They walk 100 feet outside, okay, outside the tchum, and then the non-Jew walks away. He's like, okay, he goes back, which he shouldn't have done. Then maybe it's coming to tell you Ein lo ela arba amos, that he only has 4 amos. The Gemara says, "Hanami t'nina." This was also taught in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, "Echziru nachrim ki ilu lo yatsa." The Mishnah says if the non-Jews return the person to the original area, it's as if they did not leave. In other words, only when the non-Jew forces the person back into the tchum area, then it's as if they didn't leave. Hechziruhu tegilu lo yatsa. It's only if they, the non-Jews, return the person, force the person back. Aval hotziyu nachrim echaz ladas. But in the case where the implication is in the case where he was forced out but returned on his own, then ein lo ela arba amos. And of course, once again, he only has 4 amos, right? So once again, this would not be needed. This is already taught in the Mishnah. Ela ema. So rather, we're going to say Rav Nachman was coming to teach you with the following. Let's say a person left their tchum willingly. Okay, let's say a person wakes up Shabbos morning and is like, oh, I'm going to go for a stroll, and I'm going to go violate the laws of tchum, and they walk beyond the tchum on purpose. And it happens to be that day they bump into some non-Jews in the forest, and the non-Jews put a gun to his head and said, hey, let's take us back to the city, right? So maybe in that case, ein lo ela arba amos, they only have 4, the person, Rav Nachman is coming to teach you, and that the person only has 4 amos in which to move around. So Gemara says, hanami tanina. That's also superfluous because it was already implied in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Hotziyu v'achziru, if the Gentiles, the non-Jews, removed the person and brought the person back, ki lo yatsa, that's the case, or 41b5, that's the case, it's as if he never left. However, Hotziyu v'achziru hu diki lo yatsa, only if they remove the person and they return the person against their will, that's the case that he never left, and therefore in that case the person has full usage of the regular tchum. Aval yatz ladas lo. But the implication is in a situation where the person left willingly, even though he was pushed back by the non-Jews, he still only has 4 amos, right? Because again, by the Mishnah laying out that the only case he's able to walk around properly is if the non-Jews took him out and then the non-Jews brought him back in. Implication is that then the person is as if they never left. Then the person can walk around the whole city like you and I can walk around the whole city. Implication if any one of those 2 steps is missing, whether I was taken out by the non-Jews and I went back by myself, or I left by myself and the non-Jews brought me back, in either one of those 2 cases, all I would have is 4 amos. So again, what case is Rav Nachman teaching? So the Gemara says, Ma'alatema. So the Gemara says, this is where Rav Nachman is coming to teach you, because without Rav Nachman, he would have said the following. Litzad and Kedani, that maybe the Mishnah is actually, you understood it, the second case is a continuation of the first case, but maybe it's actually 2 cases, meaning you may have read the Mishnah incorrectly in the following fashion. That Mishiotu Nachram Echaz Ladas. If non-Jews took the person out of the tchum and the person returned willingly, then Ein lo ela arba amos. Then the person only has 4 amos. Aval yatz ladas. But you may have mistakenly read the rest of the line to read as follows, which is a mistake. Okay, which is that maybe if the person left the tchum on purpose and then the non-Jews return the person, ki ilu yatsa, that's the case that it's as if he never left. In other words, he gets his tchum back. Kamash Rav Nachman's coming to teach you that no, that's not true. In other words, don't misread the Mishnah. That's Rav Nachman's. In other words, all your questions were right. All your questions are right. That really, if you read the Mishnah correctly, then you already knew Rav Nachman taught us. But you may have misread the Mishnah, and you may have understood the Mishnah to mean if a person was left willingly and then forced back, then ki'ilu lo, then it's as if they never left, and they would get their whole area. Rav Nachman's coming to teach you that's not true. Only in a situation where you were forced to leave and forced to come back. That's when you have the regular tchum. But in any other cases where you're missing one of those 2 components, in other words, you leave willingly and are forced back, or you forced out and come back willingly, either of those cases, all you have is 4 amos. Okay, fine. And that's where Nachman's Kamashma, and that's where Nachman's coming to teach us. Okay, so let's now go a little bit further. There is a case where a person is restricted by the 4 amos, but they're still allowed to leave those 4 amos. What is the case?
Yeah. It's interesting that we're spending so much time focusing on people who voluntarily decide to leave. It's when we assume that
all of one of my Rabbi Stav, one of my rabbis used to say that all of Gemara is written for fools and for Rishayim.
Right, but we also assume that they're going to want to come back and not have that same. Right?
Good. That's a positive spin, right? Risham who have an inkling of guilt right, and Jewish guilt. Okay, beautiful, excellent. Yeah, but you're right. Meaning, another person, most of the laws are like these cases where a person does something wrong in the middle. Right? Okay. But right? They asked the following of Rabbah. Let's say a person was left willingly, to Max's points, okay? And then they have charatza. They're like, okay, I shouldn't have done this. So now what's the halacha? They call over to the rabbi who's in the tchum, and they say, oh, you only can walk 4 amas, about 8 feet, okay? Fine, these are all Shabbos. And then the person needs the bathroom, and it's a public place. Everyone can see them. So what's the halacha? Are you allowed to go beyond the 4 amos to maintain your own dignity? Amar lahem, Rabbah says, Gadol kavod abrios, shedocha es losa se shebetorah. Human dignity is so important, it supersedes a prohibition in the Torah. Okay, so in this case, this is not tchum is not biblical. Tchum is derabanan according to most, and so what he means is that over here in this case, tchum is derabanan. Kavod abrios is something which is very important. We're very concerned about a person's dignity, and oftentimes it will override certain laws. And similarly over here too, if the only place to relieve oneself is in those 8 feet in the 4 amos, you're allowed to go outside of those 8 feet to go to relieve oneself. Okay, because of kavod abrios, because of human dignity. Amri Nahardai says, if the person is smart, ayal litzchuma, they came into al. Fine. So now, once the person's going to leave those 4 amos and find a private place, let's say they're walking around. Okay, let's say they went like 10 feet beyond their tchum. Okay, and now they're looking around. Where can I go to the bathroom? And they know they're allowed to go to the restroom. They're allowed to find a private place to go to the restroom. So they could go further out of the tchum. Or if they're smart, says Nahardai, he says, you know what you should do? Find a space within your original tchum, and now you're back. Once you're back, you're ready. You go back to your original, tchum laws. Therefore, you'd be allowed to. Once you go to the restroom within the tchum area, you'd be allowed to walk around in that area. Okay, so just a clever little, So you're allowed to go outside your 4 amos to go to the restroom. But if you're smart, you'll find a private place within your original tchum, and then you'd be allowed to walk around. Okay, excellent. Amra Papa. Now, Papa says a statement which we're going to be discussing for the rest of the day. Let's say fruit were taken out of the tchum, and then they were returned. Okay, so what this means is as follows. Tchum does not only apply to you. Tchum applies to your objects as well, right? You are not allowed to, objects in general. So, for example, we spoke about this before. If you know that an object came from outside the Tchum, you sit down at your Shabbos table and you have friends from Allentown, Pennsylvania, who, you invited for your Shabbos meal, and they brought a bottle of wine. It's mafushal, but the bottom line is, they brought it from outside the Tchum. Guess what? You can't use it. Right? So, because Tchum is not only about people, it's about objects as well. Rav Papa comes along and says, right, and that's why the issue with newspapers or mail, etc., there is questions about where it's coming from, okay, possibly out of the tchum. So fruit which come from outside the tchum, fruit that were taken, let's say someone took some of your fruit and then they brought them back into the tchum, okay? So I feel amazed that even if it was done deliberately, lo hafsidu es mekoman, they have not lost the original tchum area, even if it was all done deliberately. In other words, a person goes ahead and they take some, they take their food for Shabbos and they leave the tchum. They're like, oh, I'm very mad. I don't want to do Shabbos this week, and they leave the tchum on purpose. Okay, and then they say, I'm still very mad, but I want to go and tell someone something, and they come back into the tchum area, and then change my mind. I want to keep Shabbos. I want to eat my Shabbos meal. Can you eat this food? Rav Papa says, no problem. Even though it came from outside the tchum now, it's not a problem. My taima, anusin ninu, or 41b6, because the fruit themselves were forced. In other words, it's true the person did something deliberate, but from the perspective of the items, the fruit, the challah, whatever it's going to be, it is, so to speak, forced. It didn't do anything willingly. All these decrees about, going out and coming back in, and maybe only having 4 amos, that's only true when it comes to an individual, says Rav Papa. But if it's an object, since an object by definition doesn't do anything willingly, it cannot do anything willingly, it is an inanimate object, therefore by definition it's not limited by any of those decrees, and therefore you are allowed to, if your fruit or objects left your tchum and then came back into the tchum area, we could treat it as if they were forced, and therefore they go back to, it's like a person being forced back. It's no different than the case of a Jew who was forced by a non-Jew outside the tchum and then forced back in, right? And what do we say about that person? It's as if they never left. They have the whole tchum area, the same as going to be with the fruits, even though you, the owner, took the fruit willingly, and you, the owner, brought it back willingly, but the fruits are similar to the Jew who was forced, because the fruits have no choice. That's Rav Papa's chiddush. That's Rav Papa's novel idea. And the Gemara is going to analyze this. Ask the Gemara, Esvei Rav Yosef bar Shemai Rav Papa. Okay, Rav Nechemia, Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov Omrim L'Olam Asurin. Fruit that were taken out of the tchum are always prohibited. Ad sheyachzum komam shogigin, until they are returned into the tchum area by mistake. So says the Gemara, b'shogigin b'mezelo. Right? Clearly, you see that if you took your fruit out, or someone else took your fruit out on purpose, and then brought them back in on purpose, the implication is brought back on purpose, you would not be allowed to benefit from them, only if they're brought back by mistake. So then where Papa says, Tanahi, it's actually machlogas tanaim. The time is taught in the Brisa. Perosh yatzu chutz l'tchum. If fruit were taken beyond the tchum boundaries, b'shogig ya'achlu. If they were taken out by mistake, they may be eaten. B'mezid lo ya'achlu. If they were taken out on purpose, they are not allowed to be eaten. Turn the page, 42a1, Mem Beis Amud Aleph. Rav Nechemia Omer. Rav Nechemia, the end of the Brisa says, Bimkomam ya'achlu. When they're in their original area, they may be eaten. Shalobim kaman lo ya'achlu. But if they're not in their original area, they may not be eaten. Now, this Brisa doesn't read so well, because the Tanakama seems to be saying, the Tanakama says, fruit that were taken out of the tchum by mistake, you're allowed to eat them. Sounds like he's saying, you're allowed to eat them where you have them, right, outside the tchum. But if it was taken out on purpose, you can't eat them. And then Rav Nechemia says, almost like they're not talking to each other. Rav Nechemia says, if they're in their place, they're allowed to be eaten. If they're not in their place, they're not allowed to be eaten. Right? So Rav Nechemia seems to be talking about a case where they're returned. It's not clear if it's shogeg, it's mezid, and the Gemara is going to try to understand what's the case Rav Nechemia is speaking about. So my bimkoman.
Bimkoman is the question. Right? What does that mean?
What does that mean? Exactly. Ilema bimkoman b'mezid. If it means they're returned deliberately to their place. Right? So bimkoman doesn't mean, again, the Tanakhama was distinguishing between mistake on purpose. Rav Nechemia just says in its place, doesn't distinguish between on purpose or mistake. So it says the Gemara, if you want to tell me if it was brought back, and no matter how it was brought back, if it was brought back, you're allowed to eat them. It was taught explicitly in a brayso. Nechemia, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omrim, L'Olam Asurim, as you have to become Shogian. B'Shogian b'Mezilo. We have a brayso, we quoted earlier, that Rabbi Nechemia says explicitly that if it was brought back by mistake, are you allowed to benefit from it? If it was brought back on purpose, you cannot benefit from it. So it cannot be talking about a case where it was returned on purpose, because Rav Nechemia says if it was brought back on purpose, it can't be eaten. And over here he's saying, Bimkoman Ya'achlu was brought back to the original place, you could eat it. Elalab Bimkomam Shogeg. So then you have to say that it was brought back by mistake. That's the only way to make some sense of it. But then we have the problem that Rav Nechemia and the Tanakhama don't seem to be talking to one another. Tanakhama is talking about a case where it hasn't been brought back. Right? He says, B'shogeg, if you brought the food out of the tchum by mistake, you could eat it. If it was brought outside of the tchum on purpose, you cannot eat it. And Rav Nechemia is talking about returning. They're not talking to each other, right? So the Gemara says, 42a1, there's missing words. What are the missing words? If fruit were taken outside the tchum, if they were taken out by mistake, then you're allowed to eat them. But if they're taken out deliberately, they cannot be eaten. And then here are the words we add. This is only when they are not in their original place. But if they're brought back, then even if they are returned deliberately, they may be eaten. And Nechemia disagrees and says only if it was brought back by mistake, but not if it was deliberate. And what we have now is the Rav Papa is supporting himself, because now the Tanakhama is saying exactly what Rav Papa says, that if it was brought back, even if it was brought back on purpose, you are allowed to eat them. And which is the view of Rav Papa. Again, the way we're reading the Brisa right now is the Tanakhama saying, if objects were taken outside the tchum, and this was done deliberately, and they were brought back deliberately, you're allowed to benefit from those fruits. They're just as if it's like a person who was forced out and forced back. And that is the view of Rav Papa. Rav Nechemia, the second view of the Brisa, is saying that no, only if they're brought back by mistake. Okay, fine. The Gemara says, lo. The Gemara says, no, don't read the Brisa that way. Rather, if it was brought out deliberately, if it was deliberately returned to its original place, then everyone agrees it's prohibited, meaning not like Rav Papa. And what the Brisa is referring to is a case where it was inadvertent, it was mistakenly done, and it's not in its original place. Tanakama savar b'shogig shari shlobim koman. The Tanakama holds that if it was brought outside the tchum by mistake, you're allowed to eat it. Okay, even if it's not in its original place. Rabbi Nechemia savar afilu shogig b'min koman in shlobim koman lo. Rabbi Nechemia says that even when it's by mistake, you're only allowed to eat it when it comes back. But if it was brought outside the tchum by mistake, you cannot benefit from it at all. Ask the Gemara of Amitani Seifa. The end of the Brisa says, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omrim, L'Olam Asurin. Nehemiah says it is always prohibited until it's returned to its place by mistake. Shogig in. Rabbi Nechemia is clearly saying that it's allowed when it's b'shogeg. B'mezid, low. When it's brought back deliberately, then it is not allowed. It's forbidden. Miklal d'Tana Kama Savar, b'mezid nami shari. The implication is the fact that Rabbi Nechemia distinguishes between shogeg and mezid by mistake and on purpose. The implication is that the one he's arguing with, the Tana Kama, is allowing it in a case of mezid. Okay, that even the fruits were returned deliberately, shma mina, and therefore we reject this new way of learning it, and rather the way to read the brisa is the way we originally suggested, which is that there's a machlokas tanaim about a situation where your objects were brought out of the tchum and then brought back. Okay, so let's think of a practical example. A person goes ahead, and let's say you had a guest and they were not observant or whatever it is, and they went ahead and they they left your house on Yom Tov afternoon, and they're driving home, and and then they realized that they took something that belonged to you. They took some extra food. They took their own food back, but they took some of your food back. Whoops. Okay, and now they go, whoa! I can't believe I took your cake. And they come and they turn around, or I can't believe I took your salads. They come back and they turn around and they drop it off your house, right? So according to the Tana Kama, it's a little questionable how we treat these people who are not necessarily knowledgeable. Is that shogeg, mezid? But one way or another, even if we were to treat it b'mezid, Rav Papa would rule that no, you're allowed to have it since it's your food, and it's like a person who is forced out and forced back. Food doesn't have a choice, and therefore you'd be allowed to benefit from that salad. You want to have that salad later that day? No problem, because at the end of the day, it was brought out against your will, against the food's will, and therefore it is okay. Okay? How do we paskin? I'm not 100%. I'm not sure.
Just don't leave the tchum when you're fine.
Don't leave the tchum when you're fine. Yeah. Good takeaway. Okay. Let's say a person was walking and they don't know where the tchum Shabbos is. Okay, a person's walking, they don't know where it is, right? They're leaving the city, and in many cities, historically, they would have a marker. They would have a marker saying, this is the tchum, don't walk past it, right? But this person's walking, and they have no idea. The city doesn't have a marker. So mahalach alpayim b'sius beinanis, the person's allowed to walk 2,000 average-sized steps. Okay, in one direction, right? Because you have 2,000 amos, so the equivalent of 2,000 amos is average-sized steps. An average-sized step is 1 amma. So walk 2,000 average-sized steps, and you're good to go. That is great. Zohi tchum Shabbos, this you could assume is your Shabbos tchum. Okay, another teaching from Nachman.
It only starts once you realize
that you're past the city.
I am.
In other words, we're talking a case where you see the last house, okay? I'm about to leave past the last house, I know I have 2,000 amos. But I don't see any signs ahead. So how far am I allowed to walk? I'm allowed to walk. I have tchum. But how do you measure tchum? So you don't have a measuring, he's saying, you don't have a measuring, you don't have a sign, you don't have a ruler, which you wouldn't be able to use anyways on Shabbos. You can't use a ruler on Shabbos.
Measure by your footsteps?
That's what he's saying. He's saying 2,000 medium-sized steps would be permitted.
Measuring?
No, it's not. Measuring is when you use, measuring is exact. Measuring, you're not allowed to measure on Shabbos or Yom Tov, unless it's for a mitzvah, but, you have to use measuring tape or a measuring cup, but something just using your feet, that's not a problem measuring. That's too imprecise to be considered measuring. Yeah. Rav Nachman says the name of Shmuel, Shabbos bebika, person resides in an open field on Shabbos, okay? Vikifu, so completely open field, right? If it's a completely open field, then you are not allowed to carry in that space, right? You're not, and your tchum would be, if you are in a completely open field, how much is your tchum on Shabbos? You have 2,000 amos in each direction, right? But you have all you have is 4 amos around yourself, and then 2,000 amos in each direction, right? If you start Shabbos in a city in Baltimore, then you have the whole Baltimore and then 2,000 amos, right? If you start Shabbos in an enclosed home, then you have the whole home and then 2,000 amos. But here there is nothing around the person. The person's in a wide open space. So they have 4 amos and then 2,000 amos in each direction, okay? However, what happens on Shabbos? V'kifu nachar mechitz b'Shabbos. And then non-Jews show up. Apparently it's like a, meeting place. I don't know, whatever it is. And they start setting up walls all the way around. You're like, amazing. Now I have walls, right? But they do it on Shabbos, okay? So says Rav Nachman, a person's still only allowed to walk 2,000 amos from where his residence started. However, right, he says you don't get that whole space if you started Shabbos within an enclosed place. Okay, you get that whole area. But if you started Shabbos, there was no enclosed walls, then you only have 2,000 amos from your 4 amos. But you are allowed to transport objects within the entire enclosure by throwing. Okay, what that means is as follows. Now, he says once the field is encircled, it's now treated as a Rishus HaYachid. It's a private domain. Even though the walls were created on Shabbos, it's a private domain is defined by walls. The walls were created, the non-Jews put it up. It's not my problem, right? And now the bottom line is it's a private domain. So what he's saying is that I'm allowed now, when I go to the edge of my 2,000 amos, let me add one important detail. So, if you want to look at that picture just spells it out. But the person has 2,000 amos, and the area the non-Jews built is further than 2,000 amos. In other words, they went ahead and built walls around 4,000 amos. Okay, so I'm only allowed to go to the edge of 2,000 amos. Okay, and now that whole area is a private domain. The challenge is that I am not allowed to walk in the entire area, right? Because I have tchum. Right, you with me? In other words, I'm only able to walk to the edge of the white area, if you're looking at the article picture, because my tchum ends at 2,000 amos. So if I were to take an object and start carrying it, because it's surrounded by walls, and I come to the edge of the tchum, how do I get it to, am I allowed to get it to the next wall? Yes, but only because it's a private domain. The problem is I can't carry it, so what I'd be allowed to do is I'd be allowed to throw it, because I can't walk past that area, but I'll be allowed to throw it past that area. And therefore, since I'm only allowed to throw it when I get to the edge of my 2,000 amos, I'm only allowed to move objects by throwing in the entire area. In other words, we're not going to distinguish between one part of this enclosed area and the next. I'm only allowed to throw objects within the entire area. Rav Huna Amar Mahalach Alpaim Ama, Umetaltal Arba Amos. Rav Huna says, no, I'm allowed to go 2,000 amos, and we ignore the partitions, and you're only allowed to move objects within 4 amos. In other words, Rav Huna says, I disagree. You're not even allowed to carry at all. You're not allowed to throw things at all, because at the end of you're only allowed to carry within 4 amos. Ask the Gemara, why can't I transport objects through the entire field by throwing them? In other words, why is Rav Huna being so strict? So he says, Rav Huna is concerned that a person may be drawn after the object and step out of the tchum.
Right, you can throw it, but you can't get it.
You can't get it. There's a concern. The person's going to go and get it. So the Gemara says, fine. So if that's your concern, so again, why doesn't the person allowed to carry within 2,000 amos? Within the 2,000 amos, where it says, if you recall, in the earlier chapters, we spoke about cases where you have 2 spaces. One space is like a private domain and it has its own halachos, and one space is a like public domain, or it doesn't have it doesn't have an eruv. And so we said if they're open to one another, there's a decree that we take the stringencies of the open space and put it into the other space. So let's say you have a enclosed, your yard is enclosed, and then one of the walls collapses on Shabbos or before Shabbos, and it's open to an area which doesn't have an eruv. So maybe technically you'd be allowed to carry in your partially enclosed place, but since it's wide open, there's no barrier between this domain and that domain. We take the stringencies of the more stringent domain and apply them to the private domain because we're concerned that people will not distinguish, right? And so that's Rav Huna's halacha. Rav Huna says you can't carry at all, since when they go past that, there's nothing blocking you from the 2,000 amos space into the rest of this enclosed area, and since in the rest of the enclosed area you can't walk around, therefore he says we treat the whole area with all the stringencies. Okay? Says the Gemara, Chia bar Rav Amar, Mahalach Alpaim Ama, you walk 2,000 amos, Umetaltal Alpaim Ama. He says, you don't have to throw it all. You could carry within the 2,000 amos, you could walk within the 2,000 amos. The Gemara asks, Command, look Rav Nachman, look Rav Huna. This doesn't seem to go like Rav Nachman or Rav Huna, right? Because Rav Nachman, right, so Rav Nachman said you're allowed to throw. Rav Huna says you can't do anything. And here he's saying you're allowed to walk and carry within 2,000 amos. So Gemara says, and the Gemara is troubled because the Gemara is bothered by the fact that it is open to a more stringent place. And therefore, why is he being so permissive? So the Gemara says, Ema metaltal ba'arba. Maybe Rav Chia bar Abba is actually going like Rav Huna and saying not that you could carry within the whole area, rather you carry within the 4. Ask the Gemara, Hachi Hainu to Rav Huna. This is the same ruling as Rav Huna. Gemara says you're right. Ema v'chein Rav Chia bar Rav. So switch the text. Really, Rav Chia bar Rav is saying exactly the same thing as Rav Huna, and we have 2 opinions over here. One is saying you're allowed to carry within, you're allowed to throw things within the entire 2,000 amos, and you're allowed to walk 2,000 amos, and then you have Rav Huna and Rav Chia bar Rav saying you are allowed to walk within the 2,000 amos, but when it comes to objects, you're not allowed to move them more than 4 amos. We will stop here. Have a great day.